there was a time when food wasn't about flavor. It was about survival. Before vacuum seals, before MREs, before supply chains that spanned continents, millions of young men marched into the mud of Europe carrying not just rifles, but rations that history has quietly forgotten. Some of these foods kept armies alive through freezing winters and endless shelling. Others broke spirits, ruined morale, or became symbols of desperation. Many were never meant to be eaten for more than a few weeks, yet sustained soldiers for years. Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of history to remember 25 forgotten foods of European armies during World War I, meals born from necessity, ingenuity, and scarcity. These weren't just rations, they were comfort, punishment, memory, and sometimes the last warm thing a soldier tasted before battle. Number 25. Hardtack biscuits. It was said that if you dropped a hardtack biscuit into the mud of the Western Front, the mud would break first. For countless soldiers during World War I, this was not a joke, it was dinner. Hardtack had existed for centuries before World War I, long used by navies and armies because of one key feature. It did not spoil. Made from nothing more than flour, water, and sometimes salt, these biscuits were baked repeatedly until every trace of moisture was gone. The result was a rock-hard square that could survive years in storage, extreme temperatures, and rough transport across battlefields. European armies relied on hardtack as a foundational ration, especially during long marches or when fresh bread couldn't reach the front. In theory, it was a perfect solution for industrial warfare. In reality, it became one of the most infamous foods of the war. Hardtack mattered because it was dependable. When supply wagons were shelled, field kitchens destroyed, and rail lines cut, hardtack still arrived. It could be eaten plain, soaked in water, dipped in coffee, crumbled into soup, or fried in grease if a soldier was lucky enough to have it. More importantly, it filled stomachs. In a war defined by waiting for orders, waiting for attacks, waiting for relief, hardtack was often the one certainty a soldier carried in his pack. But survival came at a cost. Hardtack was notorious for breaking teeth. Soldiers often joked that it was safer to shoot the enemy than to bite into a biscuit. Worse still were the insects. Weevils frequently infested the flour long before baking, and soldiers learned to tap their biscuits against helmets to knock bugs out before eating, or simply close their eyes and chew. In letters home, men described hardtack not as food, but as punishment. Yet when rations ran low, even these brutal biscuits became precious. Many soldiers admitted they missed hardtack after the war, not for its taste, but for what it represented: endurance. If hardtack was the unbreakable backbone of the soldier's diet, the next ration was something entirely different, a food that arrived sealed in metal, heavy in the pack, and unforgettable in both smell and memory. Because after the biscuits came the tins, and with them, bully beef. Number 24. Bully beef, corned beef tins. You always knew when bully beef was on the menu, because the trench filled with the sharp scrape of bayonets prying open tin cans. For many soldiers, that sound meant food. For others, it meant disappointment. Bully beef, corned beef preserved in brine and sealed in tins, was one of the most widespread rations of World War I. The name came from the French bouillie, meaning boiled, and it became a staple across British, French, and Allied forces. Massive factories back home churned out millions of cans, each designed to survive long journeys and rough handling before reaching the front. Unlike fresh meat, bully beef didn't require refrigeration. It could be eaten cold, heated when possible, or mixed into stews. In the chaos of trench warfare, its reliability made it invaluable. Bully beef provided protein at a time when soldiers burned thousands of calories a day. It was filling, dense, and, at least at first, welcomed. Early in the war, many troops saw it as a hearty reminder of home cooking, something substantial after days of bread and biscuits. It was also versatile. Soldiers fried it with onions, mashed it into potatoes, or stirred it into thin soups to give them body. When combined with hardtack or bread, it formed the backbone of countless trench meals. But repetition turned comfort into contempt. As months turned into years, bully beef became a symbol of monotony. The meat often arrived congealed in its own fat, gray and gelatinous. In summer, tins grew rancid. In winter, the contents froze solid. Soldiers complained it smelled like machine oil and tasted of metal. Worse still, opening the cans made noise, dangerous noise. More than one soldier remembered prying open a tin under fire, only to attract enemy attention. Some joked that bully beef had a higher casualty count than bullets. Yet even as they cursed it, soldiers relied on it. When no hot food arrived, when attacks delayed supply lines, bully beef was still there, silent, heavy, and unavoidable. If bully beef was the muscle of the Army's diet, the next food was something far more calculated, compressed, scientific, and designed not for comfort, but efficiency. A sausage meant to become soup. Erbswurst. Number 23. Erbswurst, German pea sausage. It didn't look like food at all. Wrapped in paper and shaped like a bar of soap, the German pea sausage was something soldiers dissolved, not chewed, and yet it kept entire armies moving. Erbswurst, or pea sausage, was a uniquely German military invention dating back to the 19th century, but it found renewed importance during World War I. Made from dried peas, fat, salt, and spices, the mixture was compressed into dense, sausage-shaped blocks. Unlike traditional sausages, Erbswurst was never meant to be eaten on its own. Instead, it was designed to be sliced or crumbled into hot water, instantly becoming a thick, nourishing soup. As the war dragged on and Germany faced severe shortages due to naval blockades, foods like Erbswurst became essential. It was cheap to produce, easy to transport, and provided calories when fresh ingredients were impossible to obtain. Erbswurst mattered because it was efficient. One small sausage could feed several soldiers, turning boiling water into a warm meal in minutes. It required no field kitchen, just a fire and a tin cup. In the trenches, where fuel and time were precious, this simplicity was invaluable. It also delivered psychological comfort. Even when meat vanished from rations, Erbswurst gave the illusion of a proper soup. The familiar smell of peas and fat rising from a cup offered a fleeting sense of normalcy amid the mud and noise of the front. But as shortages deepened, quality plummeted. Later versions of Erbswurst contained less fat, more fillers, and fewer spices. Soldiers joked that the sausage tasted like thickened water. Some compared it to eating wallpaper paste. Still, it was eaten because hunger left no room for preference. Letters from German soldiers describe Erbswurst as both salvation and symbol. It represented ingenuity, but also the slow unraveling of a nation under blockade. When even pea sausage became scarce, morale suffered sharply. And yet, many veterans remembered it vividly long after the war. Not for its taste, but for the warmth it brought on freezing nights when nothing else was available. While Erbswurst dissolved into soup, another staple held its shape no matter what, dense, dark, and baked to last far longer than it should have. Because next came the loaves that filled packs and stomachs alike. Army bread. Number 22. Army bread loaves. It wasn't sliced. It wasn't soft. And it certainly wasn't fresh. But for millions of soldiers, this dense loaf of army bread was the closest thing to home they carried into war. Bread had always been a cornerstone of European diets, and World War I was no exception. But the bread issued to soldiers was a far cry from the warm, crusty loaves baked in village ovens. Army bread was designed for endurance, not enjoyment. Baked with coarse flour, often mixed with rye, barley, or even potato starch, it was made dense and dry so it could last days, or weeks, without spoiling. Every major European army relied on it. Field bakeries worked non-stop behind the lines, while pre-baked loaves were shipped forward in staggering quantities. In a war where fresh supplies were never guaranteed, Bread was one of the few foods commanders tried desperately to maintain. Army bread mattered because it was familiar. Even when everything else felt foreign, the weapons, the uniforms, the endless noise, bread anchored soldiers to civilian life. A chunk of bread could be eaten with soup, spread with jam, or paired with bully beef. It filled stomachs and gave structure to meals, however crude those meals became. It was also shareable. Soldiers traded slices, saved crusts, and argued over portions. Bread became a form of quiet currency in the trenches, a way to show generosity or settle small debts. But time was not kind to army bread. As loaves aged, they hardened and grew sour. Mold crept in. In desperation, soldiers scraped off green patches and ate the rest. In blockaded regions, especially later in the war, flour shortages forced bakers to add substitutes, sawdust rumors spread, and trust in rations eroded. Some men wrote home that bread had lost its meaning. What once symbolized warmth and family now represented scarcity and survival. And yet, when bread failed to arrive at all, panic followed. No matter how bad it was, soldiers wanted their bread. After the war, many veterans could never look at dark rye the same way again. If army bread was heavy and unyielding, the next ration was small, delicate, and carried a quiet reminder of life beyond the trenches. Because sometimes, survival came in a tin no bigger than a hand. Sardines. Number 21. Tinned sardines. In a world of mud, smoke, and iron rations, opening a tin of sardines felt almost civilized. For a brief moment, the war stepped back. Tin sardines were not designed as a primary battlefield ration, but they found their way into the packs of European soldiers through military supply chains and civilian donations. Countries with strong fishing industries, France, Portugal, and parts of Spain, had long mastered the art of preserving fish in oil, and these tins became valuable supplements to standard army food. Unlike hardtack or bully beef, sardines were lightweight, flavorful, and ready to eat without preparation. In the trenches, where fires were dangerous and time unpredictable, that convenience mattered. Sardines mattered because they felt like a treat. Rich in fat and protein, they provided energy while offering something rare at the front: taste. Soldiers appreciated the softness of the fish, the saltiness, and the oil that soaked into bread or biscuits. More than nutrition, sardines carried emotional weight. Many soldiers associated them with coastal towns, family meals, and peaceful evenings by the sea. Sharing a tin became a small act of humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. But even this small luxury had its darker side. Tins were sometimes old, the oil rancid. The smell could draw rats, or worse, attention from the enemy. And when supply lines failed, sardines vanished entirely, reminding soldiers how fragile comfort was. Some men hoarded their tins, saving them for the worst days. Others traded them for favors or cigarettes. A single tin could lift morale or spark resentment. After the war, many veterans refused to eat sardines again, while others sought them out, chasing a memory of brief relief amid endless hardship. But when comfort foods ran out, armies turned to substitutes, bitter stand-ins meant to replace what no longer arrived. And nowhere was that more apparent than in the cup meant to wake soldiers each morning: ersatz coffee. Number 20. Ersatz coffee. It looked like coffee. It was poured like coffee. But the first sip told soldiers everything they needed to know. This was something else entirely. Before the war, coffee was an everyday comfort across Europe, especially among soldiers used to starting their mornings with a hot, familiar brew. But as World War I stretched on, real coffee beans became scarce. Naval blockades, disrupted trade routes, and prioritization of essential goods meant imports dried up quickly. In response, armies turned to ersatz coffee, substitutes made from roasted barley, rye, chicory, acorns, sugar beets, or even figs. Germany, hit hardest by blockades, relied heavily on these mixtures, but similar substitutes appeared across Europe as shortages spread. Ersatz coffee mattered not because of its flavor, but because of its ritual. The act of holding a warm cup in the morning offered soldiers a sense of routine and control in a world defined by chaos. Even without caffeine, the smell alone was enough to trigger memories of home kitchens and civilian life. It also served a practical purpose. Hot drinks warmed bodies in cold trenches and encouraged hydration when clean water was limited. Officers' knew morale depended on these small comforts, even if the contents were disappointing. The disappointment was hard to hide. Soldiers described ersatz coffee as bitter, burnt, or watery. Some joked it tasted like boiled dirt. Others said it reminded them how far they were from home and how much the war had taken. For many, the absence of real coffee was a daily reminder of scarcity creeping into every corner of life. Yet even so, men lined up for it. They drank it slowly, carefully, as if pretending might make it real. Letters home often mentioned missing coffee more than missing sweets or meat. When real coffee did occasionally appear, it felt almost unreal, like a message from another life. As comforts vanished, soldiers learned to value every source of energy, especially the simplest and most overlooked. Because sometimes survival didn't come from meat or bread. It came from the grease left behind. Number 19. Bacon grease rations. In the trenches of World War I, nothing was wasted, not even the grease left behind after breakfast. Sometimes, that grease mattered more than the bacon itself. Bacon was a prized ration across European armies, especially among British and Allied forces. It provided protein, fat, and comfort in equal measure. But as supplies fluctuated and fresh meat became unreliable, the grease rendered from bacon took on a life of its own. Soldiers saved it in tins, jars, or even folded paper. What began as leftovers quickly became an informal ration, passed between men, traded, or hoarded for later use. Bacon grease mattered because it was pure energy. Fat was essential for men exposed to cold, exhaustion, and constant stress. A spoonful of grease could transform a bland meal, frying bread, softening hardtack, or adding richness to thin soups. It also boosted morale. The smell of bacon grease heating over a small fire cut through the stench of mud and decay. For a moment, the trench smelled like a kitchen again. But the desperation was unmistakable. Men scraped pans clean, argued over drippings, and guarded their grease like treasure. In some units, bacon grease became a form of currency, worth more than cigarettes on cold nights. Its importance revealed just how close to the edge soldiers lived. When fat vanished from rations entirely, energy levels dropped, tempers flared, and illness spread. Grease wasn't indulgence, it was survival. Many veterans later recalled bacon grease more vividly than the bacon itself. It symbolized the war's quiet cruelty, teaching men to value what they once would have thrown away. As the war dragged on, even grease became harder to find. And when shortages deepened, entire meals were built around whatever could still grow in the ground, sometimes in fields no longer meant for farming. Which brings us to a dish that came to define hunger itself: turnip stew. Number 18. Turnip stew. When meat disappeared and bread thinned, the turnip took its place. Not by choice, but by necessity. Turnip stew became one of the most infamous foods of World War I, especially in Germany during the later years of the conflict. As Allied naval blockades tightened, imports of grain and meat collapsed. Fertilizers were diverted to explosives, harvests failed, and civilian and military diets alike were pushed to the brink. Turnips, once grown mainly as animal feed, were hardy and plentiful. They grew in poor soil, survived cold weather, and could be stored through winter. Soon, they became a cornerstone of army kitchens and civilian pots alike. Turnip stew mattered because it was available. It stretched meager rations and filled bowls when nothing else could. Combined with water, scraps of fat, or grains when available, it became a hot meal in a time when hunger ruled daily life. For soldiers, it offered warmth and bulk, two things desperately needed in freezing trenches. Officers praised it for keeping men fed, even if barely. But popularity was never the right word. Turnip stew came to symbolize deprivation. Soldiers and civilians alike grew sick of its taste and smell. Some described it as sweet and bitter at the same time, lingering unpleasantly on the tongue. Children and men alike complained of stomach pain, weakness, and exhaustion. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917 left a deep scar on memory. Many who lived through it could never eat turnips again. For them, the stew was not just food, it was hunger made visible. After the war, turnips disappeared from tables almost entirely, quietly erased by a population eager to forget. When even vegetables failed to satisfy hunger, armies crossed lines once thought unthinkable. Because when supply lines collapsed completely, soldiers turned to a source of meat they had never imagined eating: horse meat. Number 17. Salted horse meat. At first, it was unthinkable. Then it became unavoidable. By the middle of the war, hunger had erased old taboos, and horses quietly entered the menu. Horses were everywhere in World War I. They pulled artillery, hauled supplies, and carried soldiers across terrain machines couldn't cross. But as casualties mounted, both human and animal, armies faced a grim reality. Dead and injured horses were no longer just losses, they were potential food. Salted horse meat became increasingly common, especially in armies suffering from supply shortages, such as Germany, Austria-Hungary, and parts of Eastern Europe. Preserved with heavy salting, it could be transported and stored longer than fresh meat. Horse meat mattered because it was protein when protein was scarce. It kept men alive when beef and pork vanished from rations. Salted heavily, it could be boiled into stews or soups, often combined with grains or vegetables to mask the flavor. For many soldiers, eating horse meat was a psychological shift, proof that the war had changed everything. Still, hunger overpowered hesitation. Once tasted, practicality replaced sentiment. What made it hardest wasn't the taste, it was the memory. Many soldiers had bonded with the horses they worked beside every day. Eating them felt like crossing a moral line. Diaries describe meals eaten in silence, eyes down, with no jokes and no complaints. After the war, horse meat lingered in European diets longer than expected, not because it was loved, but because people had learned to accept it. As meat grew scarce and substitutes filled pots, another ration quietly aged in packs, hard, pungent, and impossible to ignore. Because sometimes survival came wrapped in wax and mold. Army cheese. Number 16. Army cheese blocks. You could smell it before you saw it. Dense, sharp, and unforgiving. Army cheese announced itself long before the first bite. Cheese was a natural wartime ration. It stored well, required no cooking, and delivered fat and protein in a compact form. European armies issued large blocks of hard cheese, often cheddar-like or Alpine-style varieties, designed to withstand transport and time. Wrapped in cloth or wax, these blocks traveled from depots to trenches, slowly hardening as weeks passed. Army cheese mattered because it lasted. When bread molded and meat spoiled, cheese endured. Soldiers shaved it into soups, ate it with bread, or gnawed at it directly when nothing else remained. It was also tradable. A chunk of cheese could be exchanged for tobacco, favors, or a better sleeping spot. In the informal trench economy, cheese had real value. But time changed it. As cheese aged, it became rock-hard or overly pungent. Mold appeared, often ignored. Soldiers joked it could walk on its own. Some units refused to issue it unless no other food was available. Yet when cheese disappeared entirely, its absence was deeply felt. Soldiers realized how much they relied on it, not for pleasure, but for strength. If cheese fueled bodies, the next ration aimed to steady minds. Because sometimes, what soldiers needed most wasn't food at all. It was courage in liquid form. Number 15. Rum or schnapps rations. It burned going down, but it warmed more than the body. For many soldiers, alcohol was the last comfort before the whistle blew. Alcohol rations were common across European armies. British troops received rum, while German and Central European forces issued schnapps or brandy. Officially, it was meant for warmth and morale. Unofficially, it helped men face what came next. Issued sparingly, often before attacks or during extreme cold, alcohol was tightly controlled by officers. These rations mattered because they calmed nerves. A small dose dulled fear, eased exhaustion, and gave men courage, real or imagined. In freezing trenches, it also provided a brief sensation of warmth. For many soldiers, it was the only escape allowed. But it came with consequences. Some relied on it too heavily. Others resented its use before attacks, feeling it blurred judgment. Letters home reveal mixed feelings, gratitude, and guilt intertwined. Still, veterans remembered those moments vividly. The shared cup, the silence before battle, the knowledge that this might be the last taste of anything warm. When alcohol ran dry and courage had to come from elsewhere, armies turned again to efficiency. And that efficiency often came in the form of simple grains and boiling water. Pea soup mixes. Number 14. Dried pea soup mix. It looked simple, just a bag of dried peas, but in the hands of soldiers, it became a lifeline. 1 cup of boiling water, a sprinkle of fat, and suddenly, sustenance emerged from nothing. Dried pea soup mixes were staples in many European armies, particularly the French and German forces. Made from split peas, salt, and sometimes dried vegetables or flavorings, these mixes were compact, long-lasting, and easy to transport. Unlike fresh soup, they required no refrigeration, and even a small fire or a tin of boiling water could turn them into a hot, filling meal. Supply chains during World War I were notoriously unreliable. Field kitchens were vulnerable to artillery and harsh weather. In this context, dried pea soup mix was a reliable, portable solution for feeding troops on the move or in isolated positions. It mattered because it was cheap, nutritious, and practical. One soldier could carry enough for several meals, and its high protein content helped maintain strength on the front lines. For many, it became a familiar comfort. The smell of simmering peas could signal a brief pause, a chance to eat something warm, and a moment of normalcy amidst chaos. Soldiers could enhance it with scraps of meat, a pat of bacon grease, or stale bread, turning it into a more substantial meal. It became a quiet ritual in the trenches, eaten quickly but appreciated deeply. Yet, for all its usefulness, monotony set in. Months of nothing but pea soup made soldiers develop pea fatigue, joking about the soup's endless presence. Some mixtures were gritty, undercooked, or infested with small insects, forcing men to choose between hunger and a slightly horrifying bite. Still, dried pea soup mix endured, both as a ration and a symbol of wartime resilience, proof that armies could survive on ingenuity as much as on supply. If dried peas offered warmth and sustenance, the next food was heavier, more mysterious, and sealed tight in metal, the era's ultimate convenience. Tinned stews. Number 13. Tin stews. The tin clanged as it hit the table, a small cylinder of mystery, ready to feed the hungry. Inside was meat, vegetables, and perhaps a secret ingredient soldiers would rather not know. Tinned stews were the triumph of wartime industrialization. Factories across Europe produced canned beef, veal, or mixed stews that could survive months in storage. They were designed for mass distribution, ensuring that even units cut off from fresh supplies had access to something resembling a meal. These stews varied in quality. Some contained hearty chunks of meat and vegetables, while others were gelatinous, gray, or suspiciously thick. Yet Every soldier learned the sound of the tin opening because it meant food was at hand. Tin stews mattered because they combined convenience with calories. They could be eaten cold or heated over a small fire, providing protein and warmth. In long campaigns or during prolonged trench duty, these cans became indispensable. Sharing tin stew also built camaraderie. Troops would pass tins around, dividing rations in the harshest conditions, and the communal nature of the meals strengthened bonds. But mystery lurked in every tin. Soldiers joked about what animal this came from, or what part of it is edible. Spoiled tins were rare but terrifying. Botulism was a silent threat. Yet even the worst tins were eaten without complaint, because hunger erased disgust. The tin stew was both lifeline and psychological test, a reminder of the war's relentless demands. If tin stew offered a taste of the battlefield's industrial precision, the next ration was humble and grounding, simple grains boiled to stretch every last scrap of food. Number 12. Boiled wheat or barley. Plain, bland, unassuming, but essential. Sometimes, survival boiled down to a handful of grains and a pot of water. Boiled wheat or barley became a staple in many armies during World War I, especially in Germany and Austria-Hungary, where blockades caused chronic food shortages. Soldiers would cook small amounts over a fire, turning tough grains into a filling base for stews, or simply eat them on their own. These grains were inexpensive, nutritious, and easy to store. They could fill empty stomachs and stretch limited meat or vegetable supplies across entire units. Grains mattered because they were reliable. Soldiers could eat them in any situation, cold, hot, in a soup, or alongside scraps of meat. In a war defined by uncertainty, boiled wheat and barley offered predictability, a small ritual in the chaos of battle. They were also versatile. Add a bit of fat, a few dried vegetables, or crumbled hardtack, and the humble grain became a meal. For soldiers far from supply lines, it was often the difference between going hungry and surviving the day. But blandness came at a cost. Soldiers often grew weary of the taste, referring to grain mush with quiet humor and frustration. Some even joked it was better suited for animals. Yet when nothing else was available, even the most uninspiring grains were devoured gratefully. Boiled grains became a lesson in humility and endurance, a quiet reminder that sometimes survival depends on simplicity. If grains represented endurance, the next ration added a touch of sweetness, albeit an overbearing, sticky kind. Number 11. Trench jam. Sweet, sticky, and sometimes barely edible, trench jam was meant to lift spirits, but often did the opposite. A small jar held hope and a surprise no one wanted. Trench jam was made from whatever fruit was available, strawberries, plums, or apples, and preserved with sugar. It was issued to soldiers in small jars, often shipped from home front factories or donated by civilians. Unlike other rations, it offered a taste of sweetness amidst monotony and hunger. In a war where most meals were bland or heavy, jam symbolized home and comfort. Soldiers cherished trench jam because it was a rare indulgence. Spread on hardtack, stirred into tea, or eaten by the spoonful, it brought flavor, calories, and a reminder of life outside the trenches. Children and women who sent jams from home believed they were sending nourishment and morale directly to the front. Even the smallest taste could evoke letters home, laughter, and camaraderie among men sharing a jar. But quality varied wildly. Some jams were overly sweet, runny, or infested with small insects. Occasionally, soldiers received jars that had fermented or spoiled. Despite its intended purpose, trench jam could be as off-putting as it was comforting. Yet the emotional value outweighed the flaws. It became a symbol of perseverance. Even amid mud, shellfire, and starvation, a spoonful of sweetness reminded soldiers they were still human. From sticky sweetness, we turn to the most compact survival ration of all, designed for emergencies when nothing else remained. Next up, cheese and biscuit emergency rations. Number 10. Cheese and biscuit emergency rations. Small, compact, and unassuming, these little packs were soldiers' insurance policies in the trenches. When nothing else was available, they saved lives. Cheese and biscuit rations were designed for emergency situations, often issued in small tins or cardboard boxes. They combined hard cheese with durable biscuits, giving soldiers both protein and carbohydrates in one portable package. These rations were particularly popular with British and French forces and were often kept in soldiers' packs for days when supply lines were uncertain or field kitchens inaccessible. The appeal was obvious. Everything a soldier needed to stave off hunger in a single, lightweight package. Troops could eat them cold, carry them on long marches, or ration them slowly. They were also versatile. Cheese could be sliced, grated, or simply gnawed, while biscuits provided substance and bulk. Despite their practicality, the taste was often dreadful. Cheese hardened into rock-like slabs, and biscuits were so dry they could crack teeth. Soldiers joked that eating them was a test of willpower, but in moments of starvation, complaints vanished. The rations symbolized survival, not enjoyment. From these compact packs, armies turned to heartier protein sources, foods meant to be shared around fires or simmered slowly in stews. Enter blackened army sausages. Number 09. Blackened army sausages. Smoky, dense, and almost impossible to cut, blackened sausages were a test of patience as much as hunger. European armies used heavily smoked sausages to preserve meat for extended campaigns. German and Austrian forces, in particular, favored these sausages, which could last weeks without refrigeration. The smoking process darkened the meat and gave it a pungent, intense flavor, making them durable staples for soldiers on long marches or in isolated posts. Blackened sausages provided protein, fat, and a morale boost. The aroma of smoked meat over a small fire reminded soldiers of home kitchens and family meals. They could be eaten cold in a pinch, boiled into soups, or fried with scraps of bacon or bread. Yet the sausages were tough, literally. Soldiers often bit through sinew and hardened skins, joking that they doubled as weapons. The pungent smell could linger on uniforms and hands for days, adding to the trench's sensory assault. Still, hunger prevailed over taste, and the sausages were devoured without hesitation. From dense meat to hearty communal meals, the next ration transformed the field kitchen into a single pot of survival. Field kitchen goulash. Number 08. Field kitchen goulash. One pot, endless ingredients, and the smell of warmth in a cold, muddy trench. Field goulash was survival in a stew. Field goulash was a staple of Central and Eastern European armies, particularly in Austro-Hungarian units. Large kettles would simmer meat, vegetables, and grains over portable stoves or campfires, feeding entire companies at once. Recipes were flexible, adapted to whatever ingredients were available, which was crucial during wartime shortages. It was filling, hot, and communal. Sharing goulash strengthened morale and gave soldiers a rare taste of home-style cooking. It could be stretched to feed many, making it invaluable when meat was scarce and rations were thin. Yet the dish often contained scraps and fillers, bones, offcuts, or spoiled vegetables. Soldiers ate it with gratitude, but sometimes jokingly called it everything stew. Despite its imperfections, it provided warmth, nutrition, and a fleeting sense of normalcy in the trenches. While goulash was a feast by frontline standards, some armies still relied on preserved fish, a reminder of older traditions carried into modern warfare. Number 07. Dried cod and salt fish. It smelled of the sea and survival, salted, dried, and forgotten by time, yet essential on the front. Dried cod and other salt fish had long been staples in European navies and were adapted for land warfare. They could last months without refrigeration, were light to transport, and packed dense protein. Countries like Portugal, Britain, and France shipped these preserved fish to soldiers across the continent. Salt fish was reliable, versatile, and provided a taste of distant coastal homes. Boiled, fried, or soaked in soups, it became a crucial supplement when meat and vegetables were unavailable. Soldiers appreciated its nutritional value, even if the flavor was intense. Yet the strong smell often overwhelmed crowded trenches, and soaking was necessary to make it palatable. Some men joked that it was more suitable for bait than dinner, but in times of hunger, practicality won over disgust. It symbolized how soldiers adapted to whatever resources were at hand. From preserved fish to a simple, warm meal, the next ration was the ultimate comfort in cold mornings: army porridge. Number 06. Army porridge. Warm, bland, but comforting. Army porridge was the start of countless days on the front. Porridge made from oats, barley, or other grains was a staple in European armies. It could be cooked over a small fire or field stove, required minimal ingredients, and provided warmth and calories at the start of a long day. Soldiers often ate it with sugar, fat, or scraps of dried fruit when available. It was filling and easy to digest, giving soldiers energy for marching, digging trenches, or combat. Beyond nutrition, the act of sitting around a small fire and stirring a pot of porridge offered a rare moment of peace and camaraderie. Yet its simplicity sometimes led to frustration. Months of eating the same bland porridge wore on morale. Some men joked that porridge could be used to patch uniforms or fill helmets. Still, when nothing else was available, it became a lifeline, reminding soldiers that even the smallest comforts mattered. From humble porridge, armies sought to preserve vegetables for nutrition and morale, however unappetizing they sometimes became. Number 05. Canned vegetables. They were mushy, gray, sometimes unrecognizable, but soldiers treasured them nonetheless. In the trenches, canned vegetables were more than food, they were protection against illness. Canning technology had been around for decades by World War I, but the war elevated it to a necessity. Armies across Europe relied on canned peas, beans, carrots, and potatoes to supplement limited fresh produce. These tins could survive long transport routes, artillery bombardments, and harsh weather, arriving at front lines weeks or even months after packing. Canned vegetables prevented vitamin deficiencies like scurvy, keeping soldiers healthier over long campaigns. They were versatile, adding bulk to soups, stews, or porridge. Even the unappetizing texture became secondary to their nutritional value. Yet soldiers often complained about the taste. Overcooked during processing, the vegetables were sometimes mushy, metallic, or bland. Despite this, they were consumed with gratitude. One more meal in a war where scarcity was constant. Soldiers joked that the vegetables grew teeth, but no one went hungry when tins were available. When vegetables were too limited to fill the belly, ingenuity turned crumbs into meals. From scraps came the next ration: breadcrumb stews. Number 04. Breadcrumb stews. No meat? No problem. Soldiers discovered that even stale bread could be transformed into something nourishing if nothing else was left. Breadcrumb stew was a wartime innovation born of necessity. Soldiers would crumble hardened or moldy bread into water, fat, or thin soups, sometimes adding leftover vegetables or tiny scraps of meat. These leftover stews were often cooked in the trenches over makeshift fires, maximizing every last bit of sustenance. It mattered because it stretched limited resources. Breadcrumb stew could feed many from almost nothing, filling stomachs when rations ran low. Beyond survival, preparing the stew became a small ritual, a chance for soldiers to reclaim agency over their environment. Yet eating it required imagination. Some soldiers found it gritty, flavorless, or repulsive. Others reported accidentally cooking small stones or dirt along with the bread. And yet, the stew saved lives countless times, proving that necessity can create a strangely comforting form of sustenance. From humble scraps to a rare indulgence, soldiers sometimes received a small dose of energy and sweetness. Trench chocolate. Number 03. Trench chocolate. A bite of chocolate in the trenches wasn't about pleasure, it was about survival. It delivered energy, not luxury. Trench chocolate was specifically designed for soldiers, dense, often bitter, and fortified with extra calories. Swiss and German manufacturers perfected bars that could endure heat, moisture, and rough handling. Chocolate became part of standard rations, especially for frontline troops, because it provided rapid energy for grueling days. Trench chocolate mattered because it was compact, high-calorie, and morale-boosting. Soldiers carried bars in pockets or packs, consuming them during long marches or before assaults. Unlike other rations, it offered a small psychological reward, a momentary escape from mud and gunfire. Yet it was rarely sweet or enjoyable. Some bars were so hard they cracked teeth. Others were bitter or filled with additives to prolong shelf life. Despite this, the chocolate was precious. Soldiers hoarded it, shared it with comrades, and remembered its taste decades later, not for pleasure, but for survival. When even chocolate was rationed, soldiers turned to the most humble of all resources: bones, scraps, and whatever could be boiled into soup. Next up, soup from bones and scraps. Number 02. Soup from bones and scraps. Nothing was wasted. Every bone, every peel, every leftover became part of a pot simmering over a fire, because hunger left no room for pride. Soup from bones and scraps was a wartime staple for armies facing chronic shortages. Soldiers or field kitchens would collect bones, vegetable trimmings, or leftover meat, boiling them slowly to extract maximum nutrition. Gelatinous, heavy, and sometimes unappetizing, this soup was a lifeline. It mattered because it stretched limited resources. Soldiers gained calories, warmth, and hydration from what would otherwise be waste. Preparing it also offered camaraderie, as groups of men huddled around a fire, stirring the pot together. Yet it was a stark reminder of deprivation. The smell could be foul, and sometimes the soup contained unexpected ingredients. Soldiers learned to eat carefully, or risk illness. Despite this, they survived. For many, this soup was the difference between life and starvation. When all else failed, armies relied on substitutes, ingredients that imitated the real thing, a symbol of desperation and ingenuity. Enter ersatz everything. Number 01. Ersatz everything. Butter, meat, sugar, everything became fake. In a war defined by scarcity, imitation became survival. Ersatz foods, substitutes for traditional items, were especially common in Germany, but appeared across Europe. Coffee became roasted grains, butter was replaced with margarine, meat with soy or starch, and sugar with beet syrup. Blockades and resource shortages forced armies and civilians alike to adapt or go hungry. Ersatz foods mattered because they kept armies functioning. They provided calories, nutrients, and the illusion of normal meals when nothing else was available. Soldiers and civilians often complained about the taste, but survival outweighed preference. The emotional impact was profound. Soldiers and civilians alike were reminded daily of the war's reach into every corner of life. What was once familiar became artificial, a constant signal of deprivation and adaptation. Yet even these substitutes kept millions alive. Ersatz foods, more than any biscuit or tinned stew, symbolized the ingenuity and desperation of wartime Europe. From hardtack to fake butter, these 25 forgotten foods tell a story not just of hunger, but of resilience, adaptation, and the small comforts that sustained men on the front lines. As the guns fell silent and the mud of the trenches dried, the armies of Europe left behind more than abandoned rifles, shattered helmets, and empty bunkers. They left behind memories of meals that were never meant to be remembered, hardtack that broke teeth, pea sausages that smelled of survival, and ersatz everything that reminded men how fragile comfort could be. These forgotten foods tell a story beyond hunger. They speak of ingenuity, of soldiers learning to survive with whatever the world would give them. They speak of camaraderie, as men shared tins, stews, and morsels with one another in the darkest hours. And they speak of resilience, the quiet courage of ordinary men and women trying to endure extraordinary circumstances. History often remembers the battles, the generals, and the politics, but it forgets the small, daily struggles of those on the front lines. Remembering these 25 rations allows us to glimpse what it truly meant to live, to eat, and to survive during the First World War. Each biscuit, each stew, each bitter cup of ersatz coffee carries a memory, a story, a human heartbeat that echoes a century later. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to reflect, not just on the food, but on the hands, mouths, and hearts that once depended on rations like these to keep going. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, the forgotten, and the human stories woven through war, don't forget to subscribe to the World Tapestry. There's a whole world of memory, wonder, and history waiting to be rediscovered, one story at a time. Because remembering the past isn't just about facts, it's about understanding the lives behind them. Number 03. Trench chocolate. A bite of chocolate in the trenches wasn't about pleasure, it was about survival. It delivered energy, not luxury. Trench chocolate was specifically designed for soldiers, dense, often bitter, and fortified with extra calories. Swiss and German manufacturers perfected bars that could endure heat, moisture, and rough handling. Chocolate became part of standard rations, especially for frontline troops, because it provided rapid energy for grueling days. Trench chocolate mattered because it was compact, high-calorie, and morale-boosting. Soldiers carried bars in pockets or packs, consuming them during long marches or before assaults. Unlike other rations, it offered a small psychological reward, a momentary escape from mud and gunfire. Yet it was rarely sweet or enjoyable. Some bars were so hard they cracked teeth. Others were bitter or filled with additives to prolong shelf life. Despite this, the chocolate was precious. Soldiers hoarded it, shared it with comrades, and remembered its taste decades later, not for pleasure, but for survival. When even chocolate was rationed, soldiers turned to the most humble of all resources: bones, scraps, and whatever could be boiled into soup. Next up, soup from bones and scraps. Number 02. Soup from bones and scraps. Nothing was wasted. Every bone, every peel, every leftover became part of a pot simmering over a fire, because hunger left no room for pride. Soup from bones and scraps was a wartime staple for armies facing chronic shortages. Soldiers or field kitchens would collect bones, vegetable trimmings, or leftover meat, boiling them slowly to extract maximum nutrition. Gelatinous, heavy, and sometimes unappetizing, this soup was a lifeline. It mattered because it stretched limited resources. Soldiers gained calories, warmth, and hydration from what would otherwise be waste. Preparing it also offered camaraderie, as groups of men huddled around a fire, stirring the pot together. Yet it was a stark reminder of deprivation. The smell could be foul, and sometimes the soup contained unexpected ingredients. Soldiers learned to eat carefully, or risk illness. Despite this, they survived. For many, this soup was the difference between life and starvation. When all else failed, armies relied on substitutes, ingredients that imitated the real thing, a symbol of desperation and ingenuity. Enter ersatz everything. Number 01. Ersatz everything. Butter, meat, sugar. Everything became fake. In a war defined by scarcity, imitation became survival. Ersatz foods, substitutes for traditional items, were especially common in Germany, but appeared across Europe. Coffee became roasted grains. Butter was replaced with margarine, meat with soy or starch, and sugar with beet syrup. Blockades and resource shortages forced armies and civilians alike to adapt or go hungry. Ersatz foods mattered because they kept armies functioning. They provided calories, nutrients, and the illusion of normal meals when nothing else was available. Soldiers and civilians often complained about the taste, but survival outweighed preference. The emotional impact was profound. Soldiers and civilians alike were reminded daily of the war's reach into every corner of life. What was once familiar became artificial, a constant signal of deprivation and adaptation. Yet even these substitutes kept millions alive. Ersatz foods, more than any biscuit or tinned stew, symbolized the ingenuity and desperation of wartime Europe. From hardtack to fake butter, these 25 forgotten foods tell a story not just of hunger, but of resilience, adaptation, and the small comforts that sustained men on the front lines. As the guns fell silent and the mud of the trenches dried, the armies of Europe left behind more than abandoned rifles, shattered helmets, and empty bunkers. They left behind memories of meals that were never meant to be remembered, hardtack that broke teeth, peace sausages that smelled of survival, and ersatz everything that reminded men how fragile comfort could be. These forgotten foods tell a story beyond hunger. They speak of ingenuity, of soldiers learning to survive with whatever the world would give them. They speak of camaraderie, as men shared tins, stews, and morsels with one another in the darkest hours. And they speak of resilience, the quiet courage of ordinary men and women trying to endure extraordinary circumstances. History often remembers the battles, the generals, and the politics, but it forgets the small, daily struggles of those on the front lines. Remembering these 25 rations allows us to glimpse what it truly meant to live, to eat, and to survive during the First World War. Each biscuit, each stew, each bitter cup of ersatz coffee carries a memory, a story, a human heartbeat that echoes a century later. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to reflect, not just on the food, but on the hands, mouths, and hearts that once depended on rations like these to keep going. If you've enjoyed this journey through history, the forgotten, and the human stories woven through war, don't forget to subscribe to the World Tapestry. There's a whole world of memory, wonder, and history waiting to be rediscovered, one story at a time. Because remembering the past isn't just about facts, it's about understanding the lives behind them. Number 03. Trench chocolate. A bite of chocolate in the trenches wasn't about pleasure, it was about survival. It delivered energy, not luxury. Trench chocolate was specifically designed for soldiers, dense, often bitter, and fortified with extra calories. Swiss and German manufacturers perfected bars that could endure heat, moisture, and rough handling. Chocolate became part of standard rations, especially for frontline troops, because it provided rapid energy for grueling days. Trench chocolate mattered because it was compact, high-calorie, and morale-boosting. Soldiers carried bars in pockets or packs, consuming them during long marches or before assaults. Unlike other rations, it offered a small psychological reward, a momentary escape from mud and gunfire. Yet it was rarely sweet or enjoyable. Some bars were so hard they cracked teeth. Others were bitter or filled with additives to prolong shelf life. Despite this, the chocolate was precious. Soldiers hoarded it, shared it with comrades, and remembered its taste decades later. Not for pleasure, but for survival. When even chocolate was rationed, soldiers turned to the most humble of all resources: bones, scraps, and whatever could be boiled into soup. Next up, soup from bones and scraps. Number 02. Soup from bones and scraps. Nothing was wasted. Every bone, every peel, every leftover became part of a pot simmering over a fire, because hunger left no room for pride. Soup from bones and scraps was a wartime staple for armies facing chronic shortages. Soldiers or field kitchens would collect bones, vegetable trimmings, or leftover meat, boiling them slowly to extract maximum nutrition. Gelatinous, heavy, mattered because it stretched limited resources. Soldiers gained calories, warmth, and hydration from what would otherwise be waste. Preparing it also offered camaraderie, as groups of men huddled around a fire, stirring the pot together. Yet it was a stark reminder of deprivation. The smell could be foul, and sometimes the soup contained unexpected ingredients. Soldiers learned to eat carefully, or risk illness. Despite this, they survived. For many, this soup was the difference between life and starvation. When all else failed, armies relied on substitutes, ingredients that imitated the real thing, a symbol of desperation and ingenuity. Enter ersatz everything. Number 01. Ersatz everything. Butter, meat, sugar. Everything became fake. In a war defined by scarcity, imitation became survival. Ersatz foods, substitutes for traditional items, were especially common in Germany, but appeared across Europe. Coffee became roasted grains. Butter was replaced with margarine, meat with soy or starch, and sugar with beet syrup. Blockades and resource shortages forced armies and civilians alike to adapt or go hungry. Ersatz foods mattered because they kept armies functioning. They provided calories, nutrients, and the illusion of normal meals when nothing else was available. Soldiers and civilians often complained about the taste, but survival outweighed preference. The emotional impact was profound. Soldiers and civilians alike were reminded daily of the war's reach into every corner of life. What was once familiar became artificial, a constant signal of deprivation and adaptation. Yet even these substitutes kept millions alive. Ersatz foods, more than any biscuit or tinned stew, symbolized the ingenuity and desperation of wartime Europe. From hardtack to fake butter, these 25 forgotten foods tell a story not just of hunger, but of resilience, adaptation, and the small comforts that sustained men on the front lines. As the guns fell silent and the mud of the trenches dried, the armies of Europe left behind more than abandoned rifles, shattered helmets, and empty bunkers. They left behind memories of meals that were never meant to be remembered, hardtack that broke teeth, pea sausages that smelled of survival, and ersatz everything that reminded men how fragile comfort could be. These forgotten foods tell a story beyond hunger. They speak of ingenuity, of soldiers learning to survive with whatever the world would give them. They speak of camaraderie, as men shared tins, stews, and morsels with one another in the darkest hours. And they speak of resilience, the quiet courage of ordinary men and women trying to endure extraordinary circumstances. History often remembers the battles, the generals, and the politics, but it forgets the small, daily struggles of those on the front lines. Remembering these 25 rations allows us to glimpse what it truly meant to live, to eat, and to survive during the First World War. Each biscuit, each stew, each bitter cup of ersatz coffee carries a memory, a story, a human heartbeat that echoes a century later. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to reflect, not just on the food, but on the hands, mouths, and hearts that once depended on rations like these to keep going. If you've enjoyed this journey through history,